Maki Shibuya, and this is all I can speak in French. So let me speak in English now. So it's very nice to meet you today, and today I'd like to talk about diversity in Japan, especially educational experiences of multicultural families. This is the outline of my talk today. First, I will talk about brief history of Japanese education, because I believe that will give you some idea that education is very much related to nation-state building. And after that, I will talk about the diversity in Japan. I will show you some data about the children with foreign nationals, returning children, and children in intermarriage. And after that, I will introduce various educational experiences of multicultural children in Japan. There are at least 4 types of educational institutions, such as state school, self-help group, ethnic school, and international school. I will show how multicultural children experience their schooling and what problems each institution could have. And finally, I would like to think about what education for global era should be like. And global citizenship will be one of its key words, and international baccalaureate is one of the examples of international education. So I would like to discuss education for multicultural children with all of you at the end of this seminar. So please stop me if anything is unclear or if you have any questions. And surely I will have enough time for discussion at the end of this seminar. So first, let me review a brief history of Japanese education. Well, this is a picture of samurai in the end of Edo era and the late 19th century. At this time, the identity of Japan or being Japanese was uncommon. Rather, people believe they belong to Han or clans such as Satsuma or Choshu, the regions. They think they belong to those regions. And they spoke the dialects of each clan with which they associated themselves. And this is another picture of Meiji Restoration in 1868. This Meiji Restoration was the beginning of Japan's modernization or westernization. This is a picture of Western-style party in Tokyo in order to show Japan's dignity towards Western people. Female university students were trained to dance Western dance and pulled into the party. There are interesting episodes left how these female students improvised these Western dresses. They quickly made these dresses by themselves. So if you are careful enough, you will find Hinomaru, or the rising sun, the national flag. Surely that is the symbol of the Japanese nation state. So the purpose of this party was to indicate how advanced and sophisticated the nation as Japan was. And following in the footsteps of Western countries, the Japanese government sought to nurture Japanese nationals. To this end, compulsory education started around the time of the Meiji Restoration. A standardized version of the Japanese language was taught nationwide, and Japanese history was taught through compulsory education. So education can be used as a tool to promote national identity. So for instance, look at this textbook and can you read, please? Yes, hata or flag in katakana alphabet. So in this textbook, children learn how to write hata in katakana, but at the same time they learned this is the national flag of Japan, and they were Japanese nationals. So in this way, education was used to nurture the national identity as Japanese. So compulsory education started in 1890 in Japan, while 1872 in the UK and in 1882 in France. So all in the late 19th century. So please remember that it's not specific to Japan, but quite common all around the world that compulsory education is strongly related to nation building. That's very much connected to the national identity. So this is the picture of open air school after Japan's defeat in World War II. So the war destroyed the school buildings, but could not erase the passion for education on the part of the students and teachers. And look at this textbook. Can you guess what these black lines are? Why there are so many black lines?
Just censorship?
Yeah, censorship, very close. Actually, during the wartime, education was used to make children believe they were the children of the emperor of Japan. So there are lots of expressions related to militarism in textbooks. So, but after the war, the motto of education was democracy in new education. So the first thing teacher needed to do was to let children to erase the inappropriate expressions related to Japan's militarism. So that's why there are lots of black lines in this textbook. So these are just some of the ways history can show us that how education was used to nurture proper Japanese nationals and to foster a national identity. And these are the pictures of the 60s. In the 60s, Japanese economics developed dramatically, and there was a serious shortage of workforce, and graduates of secondary education were called golden eggs, since the certificate of secondary education was recognized to show the ability to work effectively. So with the certificate of secondary education, those graduates were employed in modern industry and moved from countryside to urban cities as laborers. So once again, education is very much related to the national development. So effective education has supported Japan's economic development. And let me say that Japanese education has been doing reasonably well in terms of academic achievement. International achievement tests indicate high levels of performance among children attending Japanese schools. For instance, TIMS, or trends in international mathematics and science study, tests cognitive skills, and PISA or a program for international students assessment by OECD tests applied ability. And the children in Japanese schools show quite high levels of performance in both tests. So Japanese schools also take pride in offering effective pastoral care, especially in primary school. So the characteristics children obtain at Japanese school, such as punctuality or hard working, and that sort of things, helps Japan's economic development very much. And even today, we can find nationalistic aspect in education. For example, look at these three contemporary textbooks. What subject are they for? 国語。Actually, 国語 is a name for subject, but in Japan there is no such subject called Japanese. Actually, 日本語 there is no such subject as Japanese, but that's simply called national language, 国語. And that's another evidence that education is connected to national language, and it is taken for granted that the national language is Japanese, and that all children in Japanese schools learn Japanese as their national language. So, however, the situation is changing a lot, and so we can't actually say that everybody in Japanese school learn Japanese as their national language anymore. Rather, the Japanese society is becoming more and more diverse. So let's move to see how multicultural Japanese schools are now. First, let's look at children with foreign nationals. The number of foreign nationals living in Japan steadily increased until 2008, when the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers shocked the financial world. And the Tohoku earthquake and resulting nuclear plant disaster of 2011 saw the number of foreign nationals decrease even further. According to Japan's Ministry of Justice, foreign nationals in Japan now number over 2 million. So that is approximately 1.6% of the population. And Chinese nationals represent the biggest group, 30% of foreign nationals living in Japan. And Chinese nationals in Japan include business people, students, spouses, and returnees. And the returnees being the native Japanese and their offspring who lived in China during or before the World War II, and they were left there because of the mess of the war, and they came back after Japan had relationship with China again. So they returned to Japan. And Korean nationals represent approximately 25% of foreign nationals living in Japan. So they include Zainichi people who used to live in this Japan's former colony before and during World War II. And Brazilian is the third biggest group, occupying 15% of foreign nationals in Japan, most of whom are second and third generation descendants of Japanese immigrants to Brazil. The new immigrant law, revised in 1989, made it easy for those Brazilian people to come back to Japan to work.
Excuse me. I think the Filipino became the third last year because many Brazilians went back to Brazil, and the Brazilian used to amount to 300,000, but it's close to 200,000 right now.
Oh, so that's the last data.
Yeah, it's from last year.
Okay, I'm sorry. So this is slightly old data. In this data, Filipino is the fourth group, but as this gentleman said, Brazilian people went back home quite a lot after the Lehman shock and the disaster, the earthquake. So the number decreased. Yeah, so Filipino is the third biggest group now. So so you'd notice foreign nationals in Japan are mainly Asian or related to Japanese people. I mean, Brazilian is actually Japanese immigrants returning to Japan. So they are somehow connected to Japan or Asia. And how about the children? Children with foreign nationals. Approximately 70,000 foreign children are enrolled in Japanese state schools. Of these, around 27,000 require Japanese as second language. So, I mean, Japanese as second language, JSL. So increasing the need for JSL instruction. I'm sorry, this is strange. Among the JSL students, the biggest group speak Portuguese. So once again, they are from Brazil. And the second biggest is Chinese and Filipino. The cities of Aichi, Tokyo, and Shizuoka, where lots of labor works are provided, have the densest concentration of foreign nationals. And returnee children, so these children are Japanese people living abroad because of their business or study and so on, and coming back to Japan later. So at the moment, 70,000 Japanese children living abroad, and 10,000 returnees coming back to Japan every year. And there are Japanese schools abroad supported by the Japanese government, teaching Japanese by Japanese teachers. Japanese teachers teach Japanese language. But recently, more and more Japanese families living abroad choose international schools or even local schools to expose their children to international context. So as a result, these children tend to obtain ability of foreign language and intercultural understanding, while their Japanese ability is not always as good as their peers in Japan. And increase in kokusai kekkon or cross-national marriage further indicates growing diversity in Japan. So kokusai kekkon is a very strange word in Japanese. That means international marriage, but in English they don't say international marriage. Maybe that's called intermarriage or mixed marriage. And usually that means marriage between different religions or different races. But in Japan, the nationality is, believed that quite important, and that is called international marriage or cross-national marriage. And according to the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, marriage between Japanese nationals is decreasing. This black line shows the marriage between Japanese nationals decreasing, but the number of intermarriage is actually increasing. And 3/4 of cross-national marriages were between a Japanese man and non-Japanese woman, often Chinese and Filipino and Korean. But actually, if Japanese people go abroad and married to non-Japanese, actually in that case, women marry non-Japanese more than Japanese men marry non-Japanese women, and quite often, the spouse are Westerners. So the situation is quite different in Japan or outside of Japan. So in 2011, 1 in 25 marriages in Japan involved a Japanese national marrying a non-Japanese, so 国際結婚. In 2011, around 20,000 children were born in cross-national families. So that represents approximately 2% of the newborns. So approximately 1 out of 50 babies is now has one Japanese parent and one non-Japanese parent. So in this way, we can find that more and more children are growing up in multicultural contexts. Pollock and Van Rieken define these children as third culture kids, or TCKs. They state that a third culture kid is a person who has a significant part of his or her developmental years outside of his or her culture. Probably many of you have a similar experience as third culture kids, or actually your own kids are third culture kids. So I would like to listen to your own experiences at the end of this seminar. So let's move to the educational experiences of multicultural children. So as I said, there are at least 4 types of educational institutions. I will follow these 4 institutions and see how multicultural children experience their schooling. First, let's start with state school. This is a very symbolic elementary school in Yokohama called Ida Kitaicho Elementary School. Actually, at this school, nearly 60% of children have foreign nationals. So at this school, majority is Vietnamese, not Japanese. So in such circumstances, we can't just teach them Kokugo, national language. Quite often, these children do not speak Japanese as their first language or national language. So teachers need to learn how to teach Japanese as second language. So that's a new issue for teachers in Japanese schools. And additionally, it's quite essential that the school environment adapted to accommodate pupils from different cultures. So teachers and pupils need to learn that the Japanese way is not the only way of doing things, and cultural differences should be respected. So some forward-looking schools offer opportunities to learn other cultures other than that of Japan. For instance, this is the dragon dance performed by children at Ida Kitaicho Elementary School. In this way, they provide opportunity to learn Chinese culture for the children. And Kadoma Kokusai High School in Osaka provides Chinese language lessons and Chinese music lessons inside and between their curriculum. So, like these advanced schools give some opportunities to learn their heritage language. But despite the activities in these forward-looking schools, many Japanese teachers unfortunately fail to consider the needs of children with multicultural backgrounds. The older the children become, the more difficult they catch up with lessons in Japanese. And in multicultural families, it's quite often also difficult for foreign parents to teach their children in Japanese. So, additionally, these children often learn next to nothing about their homeland at state school. Rather, some children refuse to take part in cultural activities such as language lessons or ethnic dance or ethnic music at school because they do not want to be labeled as foreign. So, as a result, they are assimilated with their Japanese peers. And one of the mothers I interviewed said that she was sad to see her son becoming more and more Japanese and losing his ability to speak his parents' language. So, and I have to say, in the worst case, not always, but in the worst cases, these children might be bullied because of the differences, such as their physical appearance or Japanese accents. So I met one boy, he felt so ashamed of his mother speaking Japanese with an accent that so he asked his mother not to come to school because unless without her existence nobody would notice he is Chinese, but if the mother appeared, you know, he was afraid. So that sort of painful case shows that a Japanese state school failed to nurture self-esteem of children with multicultural background. So this is something we need to think about to improve the Japanese state schools. So some passionate parents, often mothers, establish self-help group to pass on their cultural heritage to their children by themselves. And these are the pictures of a group called Shaozao, small grass, in Nara prefecture, where I am from. And Chinese children, children of Chinese descent meet once a week. In addition to supplementary lessons in Japanese, they learn Chinese as their heritage language. They also learn how to play the Chinese music instrument. And this group was established by some teachers and Chinese mothers. And the group emphasizes the importance of networking in the Chinese community. So they organizes field trips and seasonal events. Through these activities, the Shaozao group hopes that their children understand they are not alone. They are not alone relating to China, and they remain confident in their Chinese heritage.
Sorry, those self-help groups are in addition just to the state school?
Yes. Usually they go to state school, and in weekend they just voluntarily to join this self-help group. So this is a picture of the summer camp. It's a Chinese group, but lots of these self-help groups, including this Shaozao, have quite often serious problem, that is shortage of teachers to teach Chinese or Japanese, and pupils, children, lots of children don't want to come to school on weekends, so they are short of pupils, and most of the self-groups have shortage of money, and classroom, it's not easy to get a space to do this sort of supplementary lessons. So unless there is a passionate key person or a group is very organized, it's quite difficult to maintain these self-help groups. And some families choose ethnic schools for their children. I think in Japan there are 2 French schools, is that right? One in Tokyo and one in Yokohama. It's full-time school. And I think maybe you can tell me more about these schools later at this seminar. According to Tanaka, there are 79 Korean schools and 5 Chinese schools, 97 Brazilian schools, but once again, Brazilian people, lots of Brazilian people going back home nowadays, so the number of Brazilian schools are decreasing, I suppose. And some Indian schools, 1 German school, and 1 American school, and 1 Indonesian school. So there are plenty of ethnic schools in Japan. So basically, these schools follow their own national curriculum, teaching the national language and its culture. So after attending these ethnic schools in Japan, some children went back home to continue their education. So surely, one of the strong points of these ethnic schools is that children learn about their native or their country of origin, even though they are away from home. On the other hand, they are at risk of isolation from the locals, and this could present serious problems, especially for children who live in Japan for a prolonged period. And another type of school is called international schools. And although ethnic schools follow their own national curriculum, international schools do not follow any particular national curriculum, but provide international education, usually in English. So according to Park, there are 33 international schools in Japan. Although international schools are generally regarded as a means of educating the children of Western expatriates, they attract a wide variety of students, including students from non-Western families, and Japanese families returning from overseas, and intermarriage families. Some families choose international schools for the English language learning environment because they believe that English fluency broadens their children's future opportunities. And others choose international schools in order to avoid the difficulties of adapting to Japanese schools. Children with multicultural backgrounds often say that they feel more comfortable at international schools, where being multicultural is quite common and appreciated at international schools, so they feel quite comfortable. So once again, that shows Japanese state schools is not very successful to educate children with mixed cultural background.
Excuse me, just want to precise something. I've heard that according to the Japanese constitution, the kids who are not Japanese, who are not the Japanese nationality, are outside the educational system. According to the constitution, only the Japanese government has to give an education only to Japanese natives, and the foreign kids are out of the system.
That's a very important issue. The law of education in Japan says that people, that's not a formal translation, but approximately the people need to give education for their children. and that's compulsory education. And in that context, the people means Japanese nationals. So only Japanese nationals have the obligation to send their children to Article 1 school. There's another law about education in Japan, and Article 1 defines what the regular school is. And international school is not categorized in Article 1 school. But surely, children with foreign nationals have right to go to Japanese state schools. It's 100%, and they are 100% welcome to Japanese schools, but they do not need to come to Japanese school.
So we won't have any problems if I won't have any problem if I don't send my kid to a school.
No.
Okay, but who decides that my kid can go to a school? Is it from the local level? I mean, this school near to my house, for example, or is it a national system which integrates my
Any child is definitely welcome at Japanese school. The Japanese state school needs to accept all the children living in that area.
They are forced to accept.
Yes. If the school said no, they are just ignorant. So you can sue them. But probably there are some ignorant teachers or head teachers, so they might say no, but they can't say no. But there is no obligation for foreign parents to send them to Japanese Article 1 school.
So a Japanese kid going to an international school is out of education, usually, or assisted with them?
That's another issue. So according to the Japanese law of education, Japanese nationals need to send their children to Japanese regular school. So the Board of Education in the local area would give the family pressure to send the children to the local schools if they send them to international schools or ethnic schools. But if the children have double or multiple nationalities, usually they can choose. Parents could say these children have big possibilities to go abroad, therefore they need this education, not Japanese education but other education. Then they can go to international school or ethnic school.
What they keep using state school, because they are usually run by municipalities, so I don't know what we mean by state school.
What is the right word? Japanese public school and private school supported by the Japanese government. So Article 1 school, there are some categories of educational institutions. For instance, cooking school or driving school are categorized as syllabus school. They are not counted as regular school. And actually, international school is categorized in that group. So when I say state school, I mean Article 1 school, regular school, according to Japanese law.
So international school is in a special category like samazama or something like that?
Samadama, kakushu gakko. So that's what I was trying to say. One of the problems of international schools is that they are not supported by the Japanese government. So they cannot accept the financial support from the government. That's why the tuition is quite expensive. The average is like 2 million per year. So it's okay for families whose company pay the tuition, but if not, that's quite expensive. I have to
So what is the status of what you call ethnic school? Ethnic school, what is the status?
Ethnic school is also categorized as miscellaneous school.
So same thing.
Yes. So there is a discussion nowadays at the Japanese government, that is this the right treatment of international schools and ethnic schools, because they are proper educational institution, and actually there are lots of Japanese children learning at international schools and ethnic schools. So actually I said it's not legal to send Japanese children to international school, but in reality lots of families do that. And so especially in this global era, is this right to categorize international school or ethnic school in different categories as miscellaneous school? So that's a big issue. Yes. So actually in international schools there are lots of Japanese families or families in intermarriage families. And so, right. So actually we have already started to discuss what education for global era should be. And so I think we all agree that Japanese society is becoming more and more diverse, and the more the society becomes diverse, the more multicultural coexistence becomes important, and the more we move beyond the national boundaries, the more we need to able to communicate with others. And in global era, children need to become not only nationals but also global citizens. And I think the International Baccalaureate, or IB, gives us lots of hints to nurture global citizens. The International Baccalaureate is international education well respected around the world. The IB was founded in 1968 and provides 4 programs for students aged 3 to 19. One of the 4 programs offered by the IB is the diploma program, or DP. And if students complete all tasks and pass final examinations, they can obtain a diploma recognized by well-known universities all around the world. So currently there are about 4,000 IB schools in 147 countries, and over 1 million students attend IB schools. And IB school emphasize a balanced approach to education and promote intercultural understanding and respect. The IB mission statement states as follows. The International Baccalaureate aims to develop inquiring, knowledgeable, and caring young people who help to create a better and more peaceful world through intercultural understanding and respect. And I will skip the middle. These programs encourage students across the world to become active, compassionate, and lifelong learners who understand that other people with their differences can also be right. So I like this last sentence. They need to understand that other people with their differences can also be right. So I think it is a core of international education. In Japan, there are 27 IB schools at the moment, and 20 of them are international schools. So once again, international schools are not categorized as regular schools, and strictly speaking, Japanese nationals should not go to international schools. So that's a big issue. But at present, only a limited number of families send their children to international schools. I mean, only the families who can afford expensive tuition, or at this time, the DP is conducted only in English, French, and Spanish. So the family who speak those languages can send their children to IB schools. So in many ways, at the moment, IB schools are quite exclusive. But we've got good news about this. The Japanese government launched 200 IB schools project in 2013, and through this project, the Japanese government intends to establish 200 IB schools in Japan through 2018, so within 5 years, in an effort to nurture global human resources. Global human resources is the keyword of the Japanese government in these days. So recently, the government of Japan and the IB organization agreed to conduct the DP, diploma program, partly in Japanese, and this should open up IB education to a much larger number of students in Japan. So if more state or regular school supported by the Japanese government are recognized as IB schools, children from less privileged families can enjoy the IB education. So in this global era, I think I insist international education should not be only for global elites, but for every child. So we must provide learning environments and activities in which children can learn how to coexist with people outside of their own culture. So thus, I think this 200 IB school project has big hope. Let us observe how this project will work well with careful attention. So maybe this is the time to finish. So thank you very much for your kind attention. So, and I'm very look forward to discussing with you. Thank you very much.